everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Stench of Truth radio show here on InceptionRadioNetwork.com. And here we discuss paranormal and parapolitical topics. And this week I have as my guest Joseph Farrell, who is probably best known for his work on Nazi suppressed and secret technology, but he has branched off into several other areas as well. He has done some investigations into ancient architecture and ancient technologies in Egypt and in other areas. He has recently come out with a speculative work on genetics and giants on the Earth. Also alchemy and international banking, the survival of Nazis as a sort of quasi-independent state after World War II. I think as relates to our show, I think I would be interested in talking to Joseph about the Nazi survival and what kind of technology has come out of Germany after World War II and where this technology ended up going and how it relates to what we're seeing today. And I could tell you that you can find Joseph Farrell at GizaDeathStar.com, GizaDeathStar.com, and that'll be the website of Dr. Joseph Farrell. And you can find all of his books there, and you can also become a member and join in discussions with him and blog postings and all kinds of stuff to stay up on his research. So without any further ado, I'll bring Joseph online and we'll get right into it. Joseph, are you there?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Ted.
Oh, I'm very happy to have you, and I'm glad that you were able to make some time for us today. Obviously, you have had a very wide field of interest when it comes to looking at a lot of the different things that you have investigated over time. One of the things, of course, as I mentioned in the intro that I did, was the survival of the Nazis after World War II and where the technology that the Nazis developed, some of the secret and suppressed stuff and alternative energy devices and that sort of thing that they were working on during World War II, where that ended up at. Yes. If you could give us a broad overview of like what the Nazis were trying to accomplish with their secret technological research and what you believe they were able to achieve.
Well, the center of my research, Ted, involves a project that other researchers, chiefly Igor Witkowski in Warsaw, Poland, and Nick Cook, of course, of Jane's Defense Weekly in Great Britain, have also written about a project called The Bell. And briefly, my take is a bit different than theirs. They tend to emphasize that this project was a project in anti-gravity. As far as I'm concerned, trying to kind of reverse engineer the physics of this device based on the descriptions and stories concerning it, is that I think you have to consider the various departments and branches of the SS that were investigating these things. One of them was called the SS Entwicklungsstelle 4, which means Development Area 4. And the mission brief of that particular department of the SS was to make Nazi Germany energy independent. And this is one of the key areas of physics clues that we have for this device. But to kind of boil it all down, I think what the Nazis were after with this device was a kind of a gateway technology to give them access to three different things. The first would be to tap or to engineer the fabric of space-time and to tap into the energy of that. In other words, we would call it the zero-point energy today, and I think this was the first thing that they were after. The second thing that I think that they were after with this device is obviously an anti-gravity or a field propulsion type of technology that would give them a huge, tremendous leap and advantage over the other powers in the world at the time. And the third thing, and this is very crucial, Nazis being Nazis after all,
yes,
is that anytime that you say that you're dealing with a technology that can engineer the fabric of space-time locally, if you weaponize that technology, then, and I've said this on many occasions on many interviews, is that you have a technology that has the potential to make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So in other words, this is the ultimate doomsday weapon, and this is why in terms of the classification that the Nazi Reich gave this particular project, they classified it much higher than their atom bomb project. In other words, this to them was the gold mine. Now, in your question, you asked where all of this technology went, and the Bell is a crucial part of that question, because if you look at the pattern of the post-war dispersal of Nazi German technology, it is very clear, first of all, that the Nazis themselves were the ones driving who got the division of the spoils. So, for example, if you look at their rocket technology, they drove the creme de la creme of their rocket scientists straight into the arms of the Americans. But the Soviets got a hold of hundreds of mid-level technicians that were involved in those rocket projects that were able to reconstruct the document trail for the Soviet Union. So in other words, the Nazis are kind of setting up a post-war stalemate. Now, the reason I mentioned the Bell in that context is that if you read my research, I've written 5 books on the subject. I'm currently writing yet another one on all of this. In other words, it's a big story. It takes more than one book to tell. But if you look at the Bell into this context, I differ with Igor Vitkovsky and Nick Cook in that I think if you look carefully at the post-war pattern of dispersal of this technology, that the Nazis made good and sure that they retained control over that particular technology for themselves. And I think, and I argue the case in a book of mine called The Nazi International, that elements of that project actually went to Argentina after the war and continued to be worked on by the Nazis under the front, or the aegis, as it were, of Juan Perón's government in Argentina.
And that was the facility in Bariloche.
Bariloche, yeah,
yes,
right.
And of course, I have Nazi International, and that's an excellent book. It goes into the idea that what we saw was sort of like a furtherance of Odessa in a way, but in a scientific and technological way.
Yes.
This was like the diffusion of secret technology, suppressed technology, via an underground program put in place in much the same way that Odessa was.
Well, you have to look at the post-war Nazi activity as not the, and this is the case I'm trying to argue in my various books, particularly the ones dealing with the post-war survival of Nazism, because as far as I'm concerned, Ted, Nazism survives the war, not only in a few isolated pockets here and there, but it survives the war basically intact as an international organization. In other words, it becomes a kind of extraterritorial state. And this implies 2 things, especially if you take into consideration that they're actually pursuing, after the war, a continuance of their advanced research projects. It implies, first of all, that they have an organization, a structure, a chain of command that is very effective and capable of carrying out that kind of research. And secondly, it implies that they've got a heck of a lot of money.
Indeed, yeah.
And that they did, So yeah, I think you're dealing with really a kind of a terrible prospect. You're dealing with the ultimate in asymmetrical warfare, to use the modern term. You're dealing with a hidden target, much like modern terrorism. But the difference is that with the Nazis, they're dealing with, Lockheed Skunk Work types black projects on top of everything else.
Right. But totally under the radar. without any kind of oversight by anybody, because of course the standard line is that the Nazis were done after World War II, but in fact, Odessa proves that there was a actual real survival of Nazi ideology and money throughout the world after that. And I think that a lot of your work has gone to show that there was a parceling of technology on the one hand, seeing who gets what as spoils of Germany, but on the other hand, as you mentioned, the Bell, and of course you wrote the book Brotherhood of the Bell, and which talks about the Bell Project and how the sort of cream of the crop, the creme de la creme of Nazi secret technology was not given to anybody. That this stuff was still retained as part of their program for what, a resurgence, a coming back at some point in time. Was this like? Do you think that's what their goal was? A fourth Reich?
The goals. The reason that's an important question, and I'm going to have to dodge it because the reason I'm going to have to dodge it is because that's the subject of the book I'm writing.
Oh, okay, very good. Okay, we'll have to wait.
I don't want to give away the program.
We'll have to wait.
I get the book written, but it's a legitimate question. And let me try to speak to it in general terms. I think that the Nazis were acutely aware during the war of the fact that they were dealing with basically a two-track space program. In other words, many people have heard Richard Hoagland speak about the thesis of a secret space program and a public one. Well, if you look at Nazi Germany, the development of rockets, jet aircraft, guided missiles, and so on and so forth, was certainly the most visible aspect of their quest to conquer space. But with the Bell, you're dealing with a completely different and much more exotic and avant-garde technology. And accordingly, they accorded it much higher secrecy. So I think you find the beginnings of a long-term, let's just put it this way, you find the beginnings of a long-term strategy and plan on how best to use that secret technology during World War II. And I don't want to go any further than that because the details, the devil's always in the details, and when you know the details of how they plan to use it, then that's when the jaw drops.
That's great. Then that gives us something to look forward to. A new book coming out that will go into that detail a little bit better. Which, of course, having a show like this, you really can't get into the fine points of anything anyway, because you have done such extensive research in a lot of different areas. We couldn't even do one subject justice in a 2-hour show. So, there's we're limited on what we can accomplish here anyway. But we can safely say without any argument that the Nazis kept the best of the technology for a purpose, and they looked to the future and a future time whenever they could use this for the furtherance of a particular end. And I think that's pretty much. I think that's a reasonable conclusion that anybody could come to. Right. Now, you have indicated that the Bell seems to be the crucial point in all of this. In any case, yes. And it seems to be the linchpin of almost all of the other things that sort of branch off of it, because the Bell itself, as you have surmised it to be, not necessarily being developed as one thing, but having perhaps like anti-gravitic effects and some other things as sort of a byproduct of what it was that they were doing. Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if it was in Brotherhood of the Bell. It was in one of your books. I think it was in that one where you talked about the possible testing of Nazi nuclear weapons during the war. Yes. And how they were able to achieve over results with the material that they had, like creating a super bomb out of a smaller. Yes. And this would be kind of like a transitional technology, perhaps utilizing technology derived from studying the bell and the physics that it contained, along with the more, shall we say, regular physics of nuclear reactions.
Right. Well, you're quite correct to tie the bell to some aspects of the Nazi nuclear program. The book that I wrote concerning the Nazi nuclear program is a book called Reich of the Black Sun.
Yes.
It's actually the first book in the Nazi series. And the reason I wrote it was, first of all, to show that there are deep, deep problems with what I call the post-war Allied legend about Nazi nuclear incompetence. There are deep problems with it. And the problems began to surface, Ted, to be quite honest with you, after the reunification of Germany, when a lot of the installations in the former Eastern Zone became available. A lot of documents were kicked loose from declassification as a result of the reunification, because at that point it became kind of pointless to try and maintain aspects of this post-war Allied legend. Well, if you dig into these declassified documents, and I'll just mention one of them here, it's called the Zinsser Affidavit, and I cite it in Reich of the Black Sun. This was an affidavit that was only declassified in 1992. So in other words, it's post-German reunification, and the reason that it was declassified, you only have to read the contents of the document to find out why. Because here in this affidavit, you have a German prisoner of war who was a test pilot that was flying his Heinkel 111 medium bomber over the Baltic Sea in October of 1944, and he describes, in his own words, he describes what he calls the test of an atomic bomb, and he describes it in such detail that he's describing the mushroom cloud, he's describing the continued nuclear combustion of materials in the cloud as it rises. He's describing electromagnetic pulse effects with his electrical equipment in his airplane. He's describing the shock. In other words, he's giving details that at that time were not publicly known of nuclear explosions. So the affidavit itself calls into question this idea of Allied nuclear superiority. And incidentally, the test that he describes took place, as I mentioned, in October of 1944. This is fully 8 months before the Manhattan Project tests the plutonium bomb in New Mexico in July of 1945. So, in other words, it looks to me that you can make a very strong prima facie case that the Third Reich did develop nuclear weapons late in the war. The standard question is, well, why didn't they use them? And the answer is they really didn't have an effective means of delivering any of them to any strategic target. But you're quite right. This is kind of the hidden gruesome aspect of World War II is this tremendous technological achievement that the Nazis did, and we should remember that it was accomplished at tremendous cost and human suffering and sacrifice, because a lot of these projects were affected by slave labor.
Indeed, and of course, you have also done research that sort of branched out from there to look at the people who were in charge of the secret operations program, and one of the key characters involved in that was Hans Kammler. He was a general who was in charge of the super secret projects like the Bell, which was probably the premier one. And we have like 4 separate reports of his death at the end of the war, which are all, contradictory and whatever.
Right.
And from my perspective, I believe he survived the war, and I think that's your take as well. And I think that it was probably actually Hans Kammler who personally saw to the exfiltration of the Bell technology out of Europe at the time when
definitely
the vice was closing in, as it were. Yeah,
definitely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about Kammler and?
General Kammler is a very, very interesting character, and he's one of the most powerful men within the Third Reich. He's virtually unknown to most people that know a little bit about the military history of World War II. But General Kammler set up a super secret think tank. That's the only word for it. It would be kind of Nazi Germany's equivalent of DARPA, of the Defense Advanced Projects Research Agency. And in fact, I think that DARPA was in fact modeled in certain respects on General Kammler's think tank. Because what Kammler did is he recruited scientists from all over Nazi Germany and then later, of course, occupied Europe, and basically freed them from Nazi Party ideology and told them to brainstorm the technology trees to second, third, and fourth generation weapons systems. And on top of this, he had this think tank established within a triple belt of security by the Gestapo, which made it virtually impossible to penetrate. So the Allies and the Soviets had an inkling that this think tank existed, but they didn't know exactly what it was doing. And the really odd thing about how he established this think tank, Ted, was he established a private top secret scientific journal in which the scientists that were involved in this think tank could circulate their papers to each other and keep each other apprised. And this is a very key thing, because if you look at the technologies that the Kammlerstab actually invents, every secret weapons project that you can think of that was performed in Nazi Germany is the product of this think tank. That includes the infrared heat-seeking missiles, that includes the acoustic homing torpedoes, that includes the radar stealth material. Everything that you can think of is coming out of this think tank, where they're combining different technologies in creative and innovative ways, and quite literally doing what he told them. They're thinking outside the box. Well, the Bell, as a result of this, and the Bell was definitely under the control of General Kammler. The Bell, as I mentioned, they viewed, in my opinion, as a kind of a gateway technology to give them access to the zero-point energy, to give them access to a field propulsion technology or an anti-gravity technology, if you will, and then ultimately, of course, the ultimate doomsday weapon. And I think if you look at Kammler's record, he was wildly successful. The only problem is that the war came too early to apply much of it.
Indeed, and you have outlined some of this material in the books that you've written already. Have you done further research on Kammler, like looking into where he might have went and what might have happened to him after the war? Is that something that you're going to bring out at a later time, or? Well,
I've done a certain amount of it already in the books after the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. In Nazi International, I argue the case that the Bell, of course, went to Argentina, and the case can also be made if you consult Argentinian sources that Kammler actually ended up in Argentina. Argentina is a crucial key country to examine for the real history of the end of World War II. There's just no two ways about this. I have recently been contacted by some people in Germany that have told me that they have information about what happened to Kammler after the war, and I've been made aware of the fact that some German researchers maintain that he actually stayed in Czechoslovakia for a number of years after the war. So, there's all sorts of stories out there. For the moment, I'm fairly satisfied that the case is probably the strongest, that he ended up in Argentina, but I don't hold to that dogmatically, certainly.
Okay. Is that something that you plan on doing some more research in the future on?
Well, let me put it this way. If new information comes to me, or if I'm able to uncover any more information about General Kammler and his post-war whereabouts and what he was up to, I will certainly publish. Certainly publish it.
Okay, so we're looking at right now that there are several different areas of several different stories about what might have happened to him.
Yes.
I just find it rather fascinating, especially in light of the other people that supposedly went missing after the war, and in particular, like Martin Bormann too, and conveniently having his skeleton found underneath a train trestle, right where they said it was supposed to be, and supporting the official line.
Right.
But
an official line. Let's add this one very important point. The official line of the death of many of these Nazis, including Martin Bormann, were stories told to us precisely by, guess who? Nazis.
Indeed.
so we've excoriated this regime for the 12 years of its existence of being a regime of inveterate liars. But then suddenly, at the end of the war, we believe everything they say about the death of Martin Bormann or Adolf Hitler or, all of these other Nazis that escaped or tried to escape the bunker. So, if you were to put these people on trial in a court of law, obviously their testimony would be immediately suspect just simply on the basis of their history, their track record, and their character.
Right. Well, Bormann for sure. Kammler probably for using slave labor and that sort of thing. So,
right.
There's no question about it. What really, I guess, really, what that question really goes to probably is more the idea of why would the quote-unquote victorious allies go to such lengths to preserve a legend of the death of these people?
Well, one reason is very obvious. They want to get their hands on this technology. They want to get their hands on the people that know how to make it work. And they cannot afford to lose the political and moral high ground that they've been waging the war under by letting it be known that they've employed these people after the war. I mean, that's number one. Number two, they cannot afford to let it be known that some of these people survived the war for quite a different reason, and that is to do so would indicate that they have their hands on some aspects of the technology that those Nazis controlled. So I think that's the other reason, particularly in the case of Kammler, where you had someone sitting atop this super secret think tank that had the clearest picture of how all this technology had been brought about, how it all interfaced with other technologies that the think tank produced. So he would have been a particularly valuable prize to anyone had he ended up in their employ.
So they want to spread the lie that he's dead and gone, and there's
right.
no reason to search for him, but all
right.
the while they're looking for him.
Right, and the other thing we have to remember is that the Nazis themselves would want to spread the rumor that Kammler was in fact dead, because if you can convince the Allies that he is dead, then they're not going to look for him.
Yes, exactly. So that's good from their point of view as well. I mean, it certainly supports their idea of trying to make it seem like everything came to an end when the war was over.
Right.
And there wasn't really much of anything left afterwards.
Right.
Are you familiar at all with the secret space program work of Richard Hoagland and
yes.
Peter Levenda and
yes.
and people like this who have talked about the idea, especially Peter Levenda's approach that the Nazis who were employed via Project Paperclip here in the United States were actually subtly sabotaging our space
yes.
program so that the Soviets would catch up and everybody would be on par?
Right.
Do you agree with that approach?
Well, I do. In fact, I wrote a book called Roswell and the Reich, in which I examined the post-war activities of the American paperclip Nazis, particularly some of their very dubious dealings in the early years of getting our space program started. So, yeah, I do accept that thesis. I think that there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that they were so influential in the early years of the formation of the American space program that they were basically able, and this is a matter of historical record, they were basically able to reproduce the exact same command structure inside of NASA that they occupied and had working for Adolf Hitler in the Third Reich. So, that's not a very good thing.
No, it's not. It's like just saying, okay, come over here and start your Nazi party here in the United States with under NASA, and
right.
You guys can go ahead and do your own business.
And we'll foot the bill.
Yeah, and we pay all the bills.
Right.
Exactly. Yes. So then what we can glean from that, I think, is also verified by the activity of the OSS taking in the Eastern German intelligence network after the war, and they're sort of fudging a lot of the information from the Soviet Union in order to further the Cold War idea. So that what we're seeing in effect is we're seeing a third party here, the surviving Nazis, using the U.S. against the USSR and making sure they're pretty much on par with each other so that there's a strategy of tension between these two quote-unquote superpowers. And all the while, the third party, the surviving Nazi structure, is actually going about its own business virtually undetected and with nobody even looking at them or even aware that they're there.
Well, I wouldn't say undetected. The Soviet KGB and GRU were very acutely aware of the bargain, the arrangement that had been struck by Nazi German military intelligence on the Eastern Front and American intelligence. And that bargain was actually struck during the war, and on the American side was struck by none other than Allen Dulles, who, of course, ends up as one of the early directors of the CIA. So the Soviets were certainly aware of it. The American intelligence community was also certainly aware of this bargain. It's not well known to your average American that basically when you said the CIA Soviet desk back in that era, you were essentially talking about nothing but Nazi Germany's military intelligence left over and grafted into the CIA whole stock. But the thing that you're quite right to point out is that General Galen's organization, General Galen, the Nazi general that ran this network of spies inside the Soviet Union during the war, remained in control, in day-to-day operational control of this organization after the war. So the early estimates, intelligence estimates of Soviet military capabilities and intentions were indeed, as we know now, deliberately inflated by General Galen to get the United States to respond to these fictitious estimates with an arms race. And thus, you started out the Cold War. So yes, the Nazis had a great deal to do with engineering the Cold War tensions.
Yes, and of course that also gets into money too, because a lot of the money that's being poured into the space race and all of the other military programs, a lot of that can be funneled into black projects and just be funneled away to God knows where to do some kind of God knows what kind of research that nobody even has any clue about what's happening. Yeah. Right. So and I think you've done a good job of pointing that out in the work that you've done on the Nazis after World War II. I think with the technology that you uncover with the Bell, and talking about the declassification of material, 70 years after the war is over or 60 years. I know from personal experience myself, and I'm sure you're aware, that there are still classified materials from World War II, which sort of it really doesn't make any sense from any rational point of view, except from the perspective that the things being discussed within the technical papers, especially within like technical research teams that were sent into like secret underground bases and things like that in Germany and in occupied territory, is because they were discussing things that are still secret today.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And what's fascinating about that is if you just apply a little bit of reason and a little bit of logic to looking at that particular phenomenon, one has to ask that if they had technology 70 years ago that is still secret today, then that implies quite obviously that they have been developing that secret technology for 70 years, and where we're at today is what? Almost impossible to guess, I would imagine.
Well, I think there's two aspects of what you're getting at here. I don't know that the reason for classification would go simply to keep the technology classified, but rather the physics concepts behind that technology. And the reason I say that is that if you go back to General Kammler and look what he did, he effectively told his scientists and technicians to think outside of the box of what the Nazis called Jewish physics. In other words, to think outside the box of relativity theory and think along a completely different physics paradigm. Now, I think that they probably came up, all the indications are, if you read all of my books very carefully, all the indications are that they came up with a completely different paradigm of physics that led to a completely different paradigm of technology. And I think that's the reason for the classification. But you're quite right. If you can imagine that the Nazis with this Bell device actually had something that eyewitnesses report levitated, glowed, and so on and so forth, gave off very deadly field effects and so on, and this is all outlined in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell. If you can project that technology forward from 1944, forward 60, 65 years, with enough money and manpower, then you're dealing with the very likely possibility that this technology has now been developed far in excess of anything that we might possibly imagine. And that's, again, a rather frightening prospect.
It is, especially when the players are so completely unknown. We can only guess what the motivations are, and really have no idea where they're leading with this. And it is a frightening prospect to think that they're advancing on physics technology and advancing the technology of that physics to points where weaponization ideas are horrible, but there may be even other consequences that are even worse.
Well, again, like I said, I'm writing a book now about where they wanted to go with this, and the Nazis were very clear during the war where they wanted to go with this. It's just that most people don't know where to look to find this out. And again, like I say, when you do read this book that I'm writing now, the jaw will drop.
I'm sure it will.
I plan to use this.
Yes, I've been quite intrigued by a lot of the things that you've uncovered, and I think you've done a really excellent job of putting a lot of these things together. And you do deserve a lot of credit. And I think everything again, as we've been discussing this, comes back to the physics concepts that surround the Bell project, and this is sort of like a new type of physics which involves torsion fields. And this is something that you look at quite in depth in several of your books, and this was something that was being investigated from a physics point of view by certain people at various times throughout history. But for the most part, what we're left with today is the the relativity and the quantum physics, which there seems to be a sort of dichotomy between those two.
Yes.
And yet we have this third sort of if you want to call it a bastard stepchild of the whole thing, which a lot of people don't give a lot of credence to, this idea of torsion physics. And I know it's going to be impossible for you to give us like a brief idea of what this means. But if you could give us a sort of like gloss on
Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, sort of like maybe give us an idea of what this is. Yeah.
Torsion. The reason. Let's start first of all with the reason why most physicists dismiss it. If you look at the mathematical expressions of torsion, there's two different versions of it. There's the Einstein-Cartan torsion tensor, and then there's the Ricci torsion tensor. In the Einstein-Cartan tensor, the effect of torsion is very, very minimal, and therefore it tends to be disregarded by most physicists, except in systems that are very, very large, like a rotating star and so on and so forth. The Ricci version is a bit different. The effect is a little bit more pronounced. But the concept is itself very interesting. If you want to give a simple illustration of what torsion is and what it does to the fabric of space-time, if you can imagine taking a soda can and emptying it of its soda and then wringing it in both hands like a dish rag, what the can will do, the can representing space-time, what the can will do is it will spiral and fold and pleat. And that's exactly what torsion does to the fabric of space-time. It spirals it, it folds it, and to a certain extent, it warps and rotates the fabric of space-time. And this is, as you correctly point out, this is exactly the kind of physics that I think that, pardon me, that the Nazis were investigating with the bell.
And is this would this be like akin to what we see like in traditional physics and astronomy? Would that be something that might be represented by like a wormhole or like a black hole or something This is totally different.
No, this is different. This is different because
I wanted you to clarify that because a lot of people might think that they were the same thing, but
no, they're not at all. Torsion. The difficulty with wormholes is, you do have the ability to open up interdimensional gateways and so on and so forth. But the problem is a wormhole is a billion times tinier than tiny, and it takes a heck of a lot of energy to open one up. With torsion, however, you have a very, very different thing that can be opened up within large but normal energy requirements on the one hand, and then number two, it's not restricted in its size. In other words, you can have very large or you can have very small torsion fields, and therefore you can actually deal with physical objects inside of them. You don't have to squeeze things down to things the size of the Planck length, which, again, to use my kind of hyperbolic expression, is a billion times tinier than tiny. Torsion fields are very, very different, and the key for our purposes, Ted, is that they are locally engineerable. That's the key. They're locally engineerable warpings of the fabric of space-time.
And the mechanisms by which the Nazis used this with the Bell experiment seem to be relatively simple. I mean, in the grand scheme of things. I mean, obviously the construction of the machinery and everything would have a certain degree of technical sophistication, but actually it really just involves rotating certain materials and the application of electricity or energy in some form. So it's it's something that is very easy for one to imagine the development of, because it doesn't require a 21st century type of advanced technological arrangement to construct this sort of material. So they did have a background that was quite capable of producing what we see with the bell and with the production of the torsion field. And you had mentioned like the field effects and some of the other descriptions and things that go along with the bell. And I know that you and some other people have speculated that we might have actually seen a bell-like device at some point in time with what happened in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, and the recovery of this particular thing, whatever it was, may have been like a some type of working prototype of this thing, in using the anti-gravitic effects to actually travel and move about, and perhaps for whatever reason it crashed and ended up where do you think that ended up at? Do you have
the Kecksburg story, I tend to follow the research of Stan Gordon, who I think has done just yeoman's work in tracking down that story. I tend to follow his suggestion that the Kecksburg device, whatever it was, eventually ended up at Wright-Patterson Air Base outside of Dayton, Ohio. Where it went from there, nobody knows, but that seems to be where that ended up. I think. Yes, go ahead.
I was going to ask you: do you see, like, if we were able to capture like a prototype of this? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it wasn't our own thing that we sent up. That this was perhaps a third party that was doing whatever they were doing. Did this enable the United States to actually like engineer this technology themselves? Would you say that the United States now has access to the same kind of technology that ran that device?
Well, if you grant the premise that the Kecksburg Acorn is some sort of bell-like device, which I think it was, because I think the data points, which I'm the first one that drew attention to the fact that the Kecksburg Acorn did so closely resemble the Nazi bell.
Indeed.
The Kecksburg Acorn, if it was some sort of bell-like device, then yes, the implication is that the United States certainly gained access to a technology that it would have been easily able to reverse engineer. The problem that we're looking at is the Kecksburg Acorn crashes in December of 1965. And the Bell reports, the stories about the Bell, come from the year 1944. So in other words, the Nazis have a 21-year head start. If what happened at Kecksburg was the crash of one of their devices.
If they were operating it. Like from a third location somewhere.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
All right, we'll get into that a little bit more in the second half of the show. We're going to take a little break now for some network business, and we'll be gone for probably about 3 minutes or so. And when we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more with Dr. Joseph Farrell about Nazi suppressed and secret technology. We'll get into the Bell a little bit more, and we'll talk about some other different connections and go in depth a little bit more on some of these subjects. But right now we'll take a little break, so stay tuned. We'll be back in a few minutes with more with Dr. Joseph Farrell.
Hi, Bob Tarmac for MJ'sHealthyWay.com. Are you into vitamins, nutrition, meal replacements, health shakes, Keeping your body in good shape, your internal engine going. Boy, do I have a perfect place for you. MJ'sHealthyWay.com. They offer the best service and products, and they'll tell you anything you need to know about any product they have to offer. I get all my vitamins, meal replacements, shakes from MJ'sHealthyWay.com. That's spelled MJ'sHealthyWay.com. There's so much more at the website. Go check it out. MJ'sHealthyWay.com.
Hey guys, Jamie Havoc in here for UFO Mag. Do you want to receive the best writing there is in ufology, the best writers, editors, and flat out the best magazine that ufology can offer? If so, I highly recommend UFO Magazine. You can check it out at ufomag.com. And if you mention that you heard this on radio, you can get 6 issues for $19.95. Check it out, ufomag.com. Don't miss out. And keep up to date on the hottest topics in ufology. For UFO Mag, this is Jamie Havoc. Hey guys, your host of Inception Radio, Jamie Havoc here. Remember, Inception Radio is live each week, Friday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, as we welcome a new guest and go over UFO-related news, open up the phone lines, and take your questions from chat and call-ins. 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Friday nights. I'll see you there. Thanks for all the support. Take care.
Hi, can you hear my voice? Imagine how many other people can hear it too. If you have advertising needs, then look no further. The Inception Radio Network currently has openings for on-air advertisements and radio show sponsorships. Given any thought to your target demographic? Inception has you covered there too. Advertising on a network gives you multiple opportunities to advertise on a wide variety of radio show broadcasts, and we have one to fit every advertising need. You know, in recent years, internet radio has exhibited a phenomenal listener growth. An Arbitron Edison survey shows that online radio boosts at least 33 million unique visitors each week and 54 million each month. And that number amazingly continues to grow. And these listeners are a part of many businesses' core demographics. And surveys have shown that internet radio listeners are far more likely than regular radio listeners to spend money on a whole range of activities. You know, internet listeners vote, they dine out and eat fast food, and they grab a cup of coffee. And here's the interesting one. They buy items online at a much higher rate than all other market segments combined. Internet radio also enables businesses to connect with consumers during work hours, where increasingly more lifestyle decisions are being made. Advertise with the best. The Inception Radio Network offers competitive advertising rates to fit just about anyone's advertising budget. Stop by today at www.inceptionradionetwork.com or call us toll-free at 1-888-919-2355. Get the word out. Get results with the Inception Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Stench of Truth radio show here on InceptionRadioNetwork.com every Friday from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And this week I have as my guest the esteemed Dr. Joseph Farrell, well known for his books on Nazi survival, the Nazi Bell, and many more. Cosmic War, Roswell. He's looked into genetics and giants in the past, even international finance, which is quite fascinating itself. So a very wide brief for Dr. Farrell. We were discussing prior to the break, we were talking about the bell and its connection with the Kecksburg object, the acorn, and we were talking about the likelihood that this was in fact the same device. Of course, there are all kinds of questions that would come out as a result of that. Who was in charge of the device, where it came from, and where it ultimately ended up, which, of course, where it ended up after we took it is an open question. And, of course, we don't know where it ultimately came from either, which is an intriguing question in and of itself, because this could point to a third operator in this field, and that could give a lot more credence to the idea of a surviving Nazi, what would you say, a government, an entity, a third party in the space race, and the program for exotic propulsion systems, this sort of thing. So it does go into what we were discussing a little bit in the first half of the show, how the Nazis sort of played a game of tension in the Cold War in order to develop their technologies separately and for the most part secretly. And it could be that the Kecksburg device was being conducted by a third party, and that may have been the surviving Nazi state in one form or another. Joseph, I wanted to ask you, before we get into a little bit more about the Bell and some of the development of it, because obviously, as we pointed out earlier, this is sort of like the linchpin of a lot of this. The idea of the physics behind the Bell and what the the side effects of it, and where this could lead as far as like technological developments go. There is an awful lot of emphasis placed by certain people in researching Nazi technology and Nazi survival and in just Nazis in general into the occult side of things.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you, do you give any credence to the idea that there was an occultic driving force behind some of the Nazi ideology, and did it actually manifest itself in any way in their pursuit of technology?
Oh, absolutely. I do give that credence. You mentioned Peter Levenda, and he's done an awful lot of research on that aspect of things. I explore the influence of occult belief systems and doctrine, not so much in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, but in another book of mine called The Philosopher's Stone. And it's very clear, if you look at the physics conceptions behind the Bell and the physics conceptions behind certain occult doctrines that were definitely being promulgated inside of the SS prior to the war, there's definitely a conceptual connection. So, in other words, not only do you have an ideological basis in occult belief, but you also have a physics basis. And let me give you the premier example of why that's so. We all know what the corporate logo of Nazism is. It's the swastika, all right?
Yes.
And if you look at that symbol as a physics symbol, what do you have? You have a vector diagram. You have two subsystems. You've got a subsystem of rotation represented by the four outer arms of the swastika, and then you have a subsystem of stress represented by the four inner arms of the swastika. So in other words, right there in the corporate logo, so to speak, of the Nazi party, you have the symbol of the type of physics and the type of occult systems that they're pursuing, and it's right there in their symbol. So yeah, I give a great deal of credence to that, and that's an excellent question.
Yeah, well, I was wondering because somebody had mentioned in the chat room, in fact, it was the show producer had mentioned Vril, the idea of the Vril, and of course there was a Vril society, and of course the Bulwer Lytton. Yeah, he's the one that originally mentioned the idea of the Vril, and this is sort of like. I don't know. What do you think of the Vril and the connection with the?
Well, I do not. One of the things I'm I'm pointing out in the Philosopher's Stone is that the standard connections that most people draw between the occult and Nazi pursuit of alternative types of physics is not so much coming from the Vril Society or the Thule Gesellschaft or any of these institutions. It's coming from a particular fellow who was known, quite literally, nicknamed as Himmler's Rasputin. This was an SS brigadier general by the name of Karl Maria Willigut. And in his system of occult doctrine, you have the entire cosmos coming out of or arising from a system of counter-rotation, in other words, of torsion. So in other words, you don't even have to go to the Vril Society. You can go directly to Himmler's occult guru and see where all of these physics conceptions are coming out of.
Mm. So like obviously with the name of the book Philosopher's Stone, there's a connection with alchemy as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Because what the Nazis are dealing with in their thinking, in their conception, the physical medium itself is following certain conceptions within quantum mechanics. The physical medium itself is an information creating and transforming medium, and the method and means of that transformation is precisely through systems of rotation. So we're back, yet again to the idea of torsion. So yes, the Nazis are deeply steeped in alchemical systems of thought and alchemical methods and so on.
Do you think that this was part of the basis of what Hans Kammler's group was doing, that they were actually like rediscovering alchemical theory and putting it into practical use, at least to some extent?
Well, yes, I do, and the reason that I can say that with some confidence is in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, I reproduce an article that appeared in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in 1924. The article was written by none other than Professor Dr. Walter Gerlach, who was an internationally famous physicist. In fact, he was the second participant in the famous Stern-Gerlach experiment, which won Stern the Nobel Physics Prize. So in other words, Gerlach was not a second-stringer physicist, all right? Mm-hmm. In this article, he actually mentions certain experiments that had been performed in the Weimar Republic that documented a transformation of mercury into gold under certain conditions of high electrical stress, all right? Now, it's interesting because in that article, he specifically uses the term alchemy to describe what he's seeing, all right? Now, the reason that's significant is that it is precisely Dr. Walter Gerlach who ends up as the physics part of the project called the Bell. So in other words, you've got yet again another little connection between someone who perceives a connection between alchemical belief and doctrine on the one hand, and someone who is also an internationally known and renowned physicist on the other, and he turns out to be the guy that's in charge of the Bell Project.
Indeed, and I do recall from the book the document you're talking about, and I remember reading that, and I was quite astounded by it. And in fact, this is and again here we've come back to sort of like the beginning of where they went with the Bell technology, because we have the idea of mercury, number one,
yes.
which has a strong connection with the alchemical side of things, because this was something that the alchemists were quite intrigued with, the idea of mercury, quicksilver, and also with the Bell we have a possible derivative of mercury or some type of isotope or a mixture of isotopes that involve mercury being used as within the torsion field to create the effects that we see with the Bell, and so we see a direct route from that particular point through Gerlach and his investigations and talking about the idea of alchemical transformation involving mercury into the development of the torsion field technology, utilizing a derivative or some type of compound, which that was Serum.
IRR, yeah, you're referring to IRR Serum 525.
Yes, 525. Yeah,
this was a compound that the recipe. I get into the recipe for that compound in the Philosopher's Stone. I briefly discuss it in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, but to fully go into all the details of this particular project, it really does require several books to bring out the full ramifications of it. But you're quite correct. This IRR Serum 525 appears to have been composed of a compound of mercury and most likely thorium or beryllium oxide. In my opinion, it was probably thorium for certain reasons that I get into in the Philosopher's Stone, not the least of which was its apparent ability to have an isomer, which is a kind of a nuclear isotope whose nucleus is in a very, very high state of spin. And thorium-229 isomer is one of those isomers that has a very low threshold of stability. In other words, it doesn't take much to get it to stop in that state of spin and then spin out massive amounts of gamma rays. So, yeah, the Nazis were putting this substance inside the bell. They were spinning it up inside of two hollow cylinder drums to very, very high mechanical rotation. And then these drums were electrically polarized with the center of the device, and they were pulsing this compound, this mercury thorium oxide, with extremely high voltage direct current electricity. And what that would do would be it would set up a plasma in the mercury, and that in turn would set up plasmoids, which are states of plasma in very, very high states of rotation. And as a result of all of this massive spinning systems inside this device, you get a kind of a torsion shear effect. You get a maximalization of torsion fields, and that will, of course, have a gravitational effect, a warping effect on the local fabric of space-time.
And then that also would then be the basis by which we could see the development of an anti-gravity technology on one hand, absolutely. And then on the other hand, we can see a sort of as you put it, a gateway into like the 0 point energy, which it's kind of hard to grasp the concept of what that is, because it's almost like something out of nothing, but in actuality, it's not. You're just accessing another dimension or something to this effect, where you're having energy that inflows from a system outside of ours into ours. And this and the torsion field itself actually creates a gateway which allows that flow to happen.
Right,
and that's pretty much what that boils down to, as far as the creation of energy using this technology.
Right.
So this in fact would be like the ultimate sort of like solution to energy problems, would be something along this line.
Yes, yeah, it would, and the other thing we have to bear in mind, though, Ted, is like I said in the first part of the program, Nazis being Nazis. They want to ultimately to weaponize this process, because anytime, of course, that you are dealing with a technology that can engineer the fabric of space-time, you literally do have the potential. Go back to my empty soda can and ringing it. Go back to that illustration. If the can represents space-time, then imagine an object locked inside an extreme torsion field of that nature. You've got a truly planet-busting potential there.
And of course, there is also a very strong impetus to keep this technology secret from a purely money side of things, because obviously there's big oil and there's corporations that are into various types of energy production, which would be completely thrown on their heels from an advance of this kind of technology, which would in effect allow virtually unlimited energy, with an initial input of energy, you would have a virtually unlimited output.
Right.
And you have quite rightly pointed out the very serious danger of weaponizing this technology, because could you imagine, like, if they had a torsion-filled bomb, perhaps?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which, like, if it landed on a city, you'd have something that would require a certain amount of energy be introduced into the system. But once it was, then there would be this massive influx of energy, which would be, more devastating than what was initially done in the first place. And I think you kind of like hinted that this was a possibility with the German nuclear program, which I touched on a little bit earlier when we talked about, was that you had speculated that perhaps one of the nuclear devices that the Germans may have tested may have utilized some form of this compound that you're talking about in the device itself, which accelerated the nuclear reaction to allow them to use less fissile material to get a bigger result.
Well, let's back up a bit. In Reich of the Black Sun, I point out that there are ways of boosting yields of atomic weapons by using less material, and the concept is called boosting. And basically, in a standard fission reaction, you would introduce into the center of a plutonium implosion device, you would introduce into the center of it a small amount of tritium or lithium deuteride or something of that nature to burn the reaction more efficiently, so that you could use less plutonium and get more bang per unit of plutonium that you're using. Now, that's the standard way of doing it. Mm-hmm. If you look at the project that the Nazis were pursuing in Argentina under Dr. Ronald Richter that I cover in the Nazi International, he actually comes out and states, and I reproduced the U.S. Air Force documents from his paperclip file, where he states that when you put a plasma into rotation and then stress it electrically, in his opinion, and he comes right out and says it, in his opinion, this sets up a gateway precisely to the 0-point energy. In other words, it gates energy that is of a totally different nature than your standard thermonuclear fusion reaction. It gates energy into that system, and you get a reaction that is totally different and conceptually outside of anything within the standard models of physics. And this is the important point. Now, whether or not the Nazis actually did that with some of this technology, that remains to be seen. You're right, I do imply it, but it's important to understand that I've found no evidence that during or after the war they were thinking along those lines.
Yes, and I wanted to be very careful about how I worded that to make sure that you were not making a statement of fact there.
Right.
That you were
speculating.
You were speculating on that particular topic. But
right.
I thought it was rather interesting because there was, as you pointed out time and again, the weaponization of this seems to be the primary goal,
right.
At least during that time. I mean, they probably have branched this off into the various other areas where it could be very useful. But certainly the weaponization seems to be the primary running factor.
Right.
Would you say that there is an active program right now that is trying to still keep this technology secret on the part of like the U.S. government and other governments around the world that may be like actively pursuing this? And is there still now today an active cover-up program being conducted to keep the third operator here, the sort of Nazi international secret?
Well, yeah, my answer to both questions is yes. Very clearly, there is an effort not only to develop these technologies by the various world powers, but there's certainly an effort to keep them secret for any number of reasons, not the least of which is that the basic idea behind this technology is relatively simple. And if it were to get out, you would have a my word, right now we're concerned about Iran having atomic bombs, but this technology, the basic conception behind it, is relatively simple. It's relatively easy to engineer. It's a sophisticated device that you have to assemble, but the basic concepts behind it are relatively simple. So you would want to avoid a proliferation nightmare by trying to cover up this technology for that reason alone. In other words, the reasons for suppressing it may not be all bad. There may be good reasons for governments and corporate elites to suppress this technology until they can figure out a way on how to monitor it and keep it out of evil people's hands that would want to use it for very evil purposes. Mm-hmm. Now, the second part of your question, do I think that there is a continuing Nazi international or some sort of third force in the world that's an extraterritorial state that is pursuing this technology in secret, existing in secret, and operating in secret? I absolutely believe that. I do think that something like this international fascist organization still exists. I think that it has a virtually inexhaustible supply of money, that it has been quite successful in infiltrating various nations' black projects and suborning them to its own purposes. So yeah, the answer to the second part of the question is also a definite yes.
Do you believe that that this third actor has been moving in a way similar to like what we've seen in the United States when it comes to black projects and off the books type of research, that a lot of this material, a lot of the technology has been moved into the private sector under corporations that are, basically like shell companies or whatever for the production and the eventual distribution and building of this technology and the research around it?
Oh yeah, I do, absolutely.
Okay.
The reason I think that's not only possible but likely is that if you look at the structure of black projects, they're highly compartmentalized. So in a certain sense, it becomes easy to conduct projects within projects. In other words, it becomes very easy to infiltrate projects and to coordinate them from hidden centers that, the government may not even be aware of. So, yeah, I think that's quite possible. And in fact, I think it's very likely because the historical pattern that we see these Nazis pursuing after the war, precisely in the United States and other nations in the West that took them in, is to do precisely that. They infiltrated themselves into the government agencies, the various corporations that were connected with these black projects. But as we discovered shortly after the war, particularly after the Roswell crash, these Nazis appeared to have been coordinating their efforts from some hidden center. And that gave American counterintelligence great pause, and they reopened all of the security counterintelligence files on these Nazis and attempted to see if they were in fact under hidden direction. The suspicion was always there, but they could never prove it.
I see. And of course, the reason I asked the question in specific relation to the surviving Nazi third-party actor here is the idea that we may have seen a similar action being done also in Germany with the distribution of the and the breaking up of the cartel, like IG Farben, for instance, and its ultimate real survival in like daughter corporations and in other companies around the world that are all like connected with each other. So it does operate sort of as a monolithic entity anyway now. Still as a surviving force in the world, and that in fact IG Farben in its current form, whatever that happens to be, in whatever different corporations are that make it up, may be like independently developing aspects of this technology in light of the original Nazi model.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned IG Farben, and most people don't realize this, and maybe you don't, but do you know what year IG Farben was finally formally liquidated?
I know it was rather late.
2003.
Now I knew it was late, but I didn't think it was that late.
Yeah, it was that late.
Wow.
That's right.
So was that like that was the official end of the corporation?
That was the official end of IG Farben. That's right. Oh. It took that long to get rid of that monster. It was that huge.
Wow.
And in fact, you're quite correct. The daughter corporations to IG Farben, will just stop and think what they are. Kecksburg in Germany, the huge pharmaceuticals company, Bayerische Sodafabrik, Merck, all of these huge companies are basically parts of IG Farben.
Yes.
So yeah, it's still there. It's just operating under a different name.
That's kind of what I wanted to get at, because there's this idea, that a lot of people look at history and they see the gloss that is in the history books, and they don't appreciate that there's a deeper underlying theme that's going through all this stuff.
Right.
Which like with the Nazis surviving, and I think it was probably Jim Marrs that, I don't know if he's the one that first said it, but I think it was in a book that he wrote where he said that that at the end of the war, the German government surrendered and the army surrendered, but the Nazis never surrendered.
Yes.
And I think you probably have mentioned this yourself.
Well, yes, I do. I mentioned that. In fact, I take the first chapter of the Nazi International and examine the actual surrender documents that Germany signed at the end of the war. And I point out that the only people surrendering at those surrenders are representatives of the German armed forces. There's no official representative of the Reich government itself, and there's never an official representative of the Nazi Party. It's just the German armed forces.
Absolutely, and that's a very key thing that people need to understand, and that's why I brought it up. Is the idea that there is a very strong historical basis for the idea that this particular group and its ideology and the technology that it had at its disposal were able to just basically disappear into the wind.
Yes.
For the most part. And that's kind of the basis for the research that you're doing whenever you look at the idea of technology being developed in secret and not being known by people and not being recognized by people as being even a possibility.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, there was one other thing that I wanted to ask you, Joseph, because there's a very strong idea amongst a lot of researchers that the Nazis actually were able to develop like UFOs during World War II. And this would be like classic UFO type things like flying saucers.
Hanabu and Drill.
Right, things of this nature. Now, it's my take, and it's based on reading your material and others, and looking at this myself, that the Nazis never developed these things.
Well, I wouldn't say that they never developed saucer-like craft. They clearly were experimenting in that area, but when we get to the idea that they were developing field propulsion saucers, the famous diagrams that infamously get reproduced as quote-unquote proof that they actually did this.
Right.
My whole point, Ted, in pursuing the Bell story is to demonstrate that it is with this story alone that we have enough details about the device that we can, so to speak, reverse engineer the physics and thinking behind it. In the case of the Nazi field propulsion saucer story, what you have is a bunch of post-war Nazis putting out these stories. That ought to give you pause right there.
Yes. Indeed.
And number two, we do not have anything else other than a bunch of diagrams and so-called plans that are themselves very suspicious. These diagrams and plans give us no rationalization whatsoever for the putative physics that may have been behind these things. Now, that said, there are indicators, and some fairly good ones, that they were experimenting with some sort of flying saucer where the entire body of the saucer was the jet turbine, which they were attempting to vector the exhaust and so on and so forth. In that case, yeah, you can argue a kind of a case that they may have been developing something like that. You do have Nazi scientists and technicians that come to this country and Canada after the war, where they, in fact, I mentioned in Roswell and the Reich, you have one guy, one of these Nazis, that actually takes out a patent in this country based on work that he was doing in Nazi Germany, all right? So you do have that story, but it's important to understand, and you're quite correct to point this out, it's important to understand that the Haunebu and Vril story of field propulsion saucers is not really based on any evidence other than the post-war testimony of neo-Nazi circles themselves.
And I think, just to clarify, I wanted to make the point that we're not seeing, like, if they did do research in the field of developing like flying saucers or these type of technologies, what we would have seen at best would have been probably a prototype.
Yes.
And that's probably as far as they would have been able to go during the war, using, like what you have pointed out, like a jet turbine in some fashion with vectored exhaust and that sort of thing. We would not be seeing, like, train loads of like UFOs being taken out of like Nazi Germany after World War II, and this stuff being like reverse engineered here, or taken apart and used to advance a quote unquote flying saucer program in the United States or elsewhere.
Right.
It's not to say, as you rightly point out, that they were not investigating this particular area. And one needs to point out too, and you mentioned Canada, and that brings us up to the Avrocar and the development of a circular, winged, like a single wing, a circular wing craft, which I believe. And I'd like to get your take on this. I believe that the Avrocar was specifically developed as a way to say that you cannot have a circular flying craft, because they developed this one and they point to it and say it was a complete disaster. It didn't work. I'm in total agreement with you. Okay, well, that's great. I'm glad you are. It was because I had talked about this on a previous show, and I said that I think that it's quite clear that they obviously developed this just to say, look, we tried to make a flying saucer and we can't. It doesn't work. And so that now, if they were working on a field propulsion device that utilized a round, single wing like the Avrocar was, that people see this, they have all the plausible deniability in the world. They can say, we already tested this out. It just doesn't work.
Right. Well, the reason I think that your hypothesis there is probably 99% likely is that the Avrocar was developed during the mid-1950s. Well, at the same time, you have a project only recently declassified called Project Silverbug, which, if you look at the plans for this jet turbine vectored exhaust flying saucer, which is exactly what it was. If you look at the plans for this thing, it's a much, much more sophisticated design than the Avrocar ever hoped to be. All right. And the really interesting thing is that Project Silverbug was suspiciously similar in concept to the patent that I mentioned earlier that was taken out by one of these Nazi scientists that had been working on one of these things in Nazi Germany. So, yeah, I think you're exactly correct. I think this was a bit of show for plausible deniability, while in another place they're developing something much more sophisticated.
And now, as far as like the Avrocar, I think if you look into that a little bit, you can see that at the same time they were developing the Avrocar, they were working on another very similar program that nobody ever talks about. That might be the Silverbug.
That is Project.
Yeah, and you can see that when they're talking out one side of their mouth, they're actually saying something different out of the other, because they're presenting to the public one particular view. While on the other hand, they're doing something else, which may in fact have worked, and we have no knowledge of it even to this day, as far as it being a working model that is being used in some fashion, or had been developed further along from that time even. So I wanted to go back to the idea of the IRR Serum 525 and the mercury, because we did have and you touched upon this. I think it was in Philosopher's Stone, talking about red mercury, which was something that sort of came and went very quickly in the. It was even mentioned in mainstream news media for a little while, talking about this as being a super nuclear material that could be used to make very small nuclear bombs. And if you could expound on that a little bit, because I think that's a fascinating story.
Well, red mercury. The story of red mercury was that this was a very heavy, gooey liquid of great density that was maroon, purplish, red in color, and that it had been developed in the Soviet Union as part of a thermonuclear weapons program to see if you could get a thermonuclear reaction without having to have an atomic bomb as the fuse to set it off. And it was a story that surfaced in the early 1990s, and it was quickly denounced as a hoax by various scientists around the world, with the exception of Sam Cohen, who was the developer of America's neutron bomb. He placed a great deal of stock in the story, because the United States during the 1950s, he said, was also trying to figure out a way to have a hydrogen bomb without an atomic bomb as the fuse, all right?
Yes.
Now, the reason that that's important is that a hydrogen bomb, other than the initial burst of high-intensity gamma rays and X-rays and a few thermal neutrons, a hydrogen bomb is a much cleaner bomb than an atomic bomb. In other words, the radioactive fallout in a hydrogen bomb is coming from the atomic bomb that sets it off, all right?
Yes.
So an atomic bomb is a much dirtier bomb. So the two superpowers were looking for a way to have a hydrogen bomb without the necessity for an A-bomb to light it off. Well, red mercury was supposedly the substance that the Russians came up with to achieve thermonuclear reactions. It was a substance that was a conventional explosive that they allegedly developed that had enough brisance, or explosive power, to compress fusion fuels to fusion energies. It was quickly denounced in the press. Now, the interesting thing is that red mercury was supposedly developed by the Russians by placing this compound, which probably included some isotope of mercury, inside of a nuclear reactor and then bombarding it with neutrons, all right? Mm-hmm. That's the story. if you look at IRR Serum 525, this substance that the Nazis were putting into their Bell device, what do you have? You have a heavy liquid goo-like compound that's composed out of an isotope of mercury that they're putting inside of a device and subjecting it to high electrical pressure or electrical stress. So and incidentally, it's of reddish maroon color. So one of the things I hypothesize in my books is that the real origin of the red mercury story may in fact be with the Bell, and may in fact be with this mysterious Serum 525, and it may be the case that the Russians got a hold of at least some of the recipe for that serum and experimented on it by themselves. So I'm like Sam Cohen. I don't dismiss the red mercury story as being an out and out fabrication or hoax. I think there's some sort of kernel of truth to it somewhere.
You had mentioned earlier when you talked about the possible construction of what made up the Serum 525, and one of the elements that you thought was probably most likely was thorium.
Yes,
and one thing that we that we hear a lot about today are thorium reactors.
Yes,
and it seems to me, because of the instability of thorium, that there may be something to that idea it being used as an ignition source, because it can very, relatively speaking, it can very easily give off the energy that is present there. And
you have to remember. This is a very important point that you're raising, and I want to go into a little bit of detail so that people really understand what you're getting at.
Sure.
All right. An isomer, recall I said that probably what they were using was thorium-229 isomer. An isomer is a nuclear isotope whose nucleus is in a high state of spin. When you slam on the brakes on an isomer, the nucleus literally flies apart. It would be like taking a merry-go-round and running it at such extreme speed that it literally flies apart when you slam on the brakes. All right, that's what happens when you slam on the brakes with an isomer. It flies apart, and it spits out an enormous amount of gamma rays. That's the key point here. Now, thorium-229 isomer has a relatively low threshold of stability, meaning that it's very, very easy to slam on the brakes and get it to fly apart and give out this massive gamma ray burst, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason why that's crucial is that within a hydrogen bomb, what actually compresses the fusion fuel in a hydrogen bomb is not an actual pressure or shock wave of material. It's the pressure or shock wave of gamma rays and X-rays that brings that fusion fuel to the necessary heat and pressure gradients to create nuclear fusion reactions. So in other words, it's a radiation shock wave. So yeah, the Nazis, as you pointed out much earlier, the Nazis may have been thinking along the lines of a kind of a torsion bomb, where they are achieving thermonuclear fusion reactions, getting essentially a hydrogen bomb without the necessity of having an atomic bomb to set it off. So yeah, this is all linked up, and I think that's the reason why there may be something to the red mercury story after all.
And of course that spawned the whole idea of suitcase nukes and all these kind of things, which were a hot topic for a while, but then they sort of just disappeared.
Right.
And I was always fascinated by that story, especially as it related to the Serum 525 and the idea that there was mercury, some mercury involved with the Bell project, and how this could be used as an energy gateway, as you rightly pointed out, and this, of course, could have devastating effects in a weaponized form, but also with all the other field effects that we see, it doesn't even need to be explosionary, because in the in your examination of the material, you make it clear that just the operation of this device is deadly for living things.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, and as has been pointed out by Stan Gordon, as you said, talking about the Kecksburg device, that there seems to be really solid evidence that this moved to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they ended up getting those ceramic bricks, which were a key component of the testing of the Bell device in Germany. And that's sort of like a linchpin thing right there for me too. The ordering of the special glazed ceramic bricks that they ordered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base shortly after the Kecksburg device was extracted out of the forest there. So we do have solid evidentiary links, and I wanted to point that out to people that there are these very solid evidentiary tracks that we're following here, and it's not speculation whenever we take these steps and point out that there are very real connections between these times and places, and between the physics and the materials being used and this sort of thing. So, and the reason I wanted to ask you about some of the little bit more outside topics like the occult aspect and the idea of the use, the various uses and the end results and this kind of thing, the third actors and that is because from the historical perspective, people in this country, for the most part, are historically illiterate. They do not understand that the kind of history that they're presented is something like you would read in People magazine. It's a gloss based on something that really is not a reflection of any kind of like real reality that we're dealing with today. And in fact, what we have now is we have people who are so ignorant of the past that they quite easily accept a lot of garbage that is put out today as being fact without having any kind of basis behind it whatsoever.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you. You don't get any argument from me about the state of American education.
It's sad because it allows this type of thing to continue. Is really the real horror of it, because there is nobody who is saying, wait a minute, look at the connections here and follow this train of thought and understand that what we're dealing with now is not necessarily, there's a lot, like, for example, I'll give you an example. Like, we have a lot of anxiety in this country directed towards our government because we're in a very precarious economic situation. People are out of work and all this kind of stuff. But in reality, there are other players at work that have brought us to this situation, and you touch upon that a little bit in your international bankers, looking at the rise and fall of the financial industry. And you've actually looked into this as well, and you have pointed out the fact of the matter is, and that is that there was this huge financial engine running that brought us to the brink of economic chaos that we have come to in this country. And a lot of this is operated outside the realms of government. And in fact, we need to look beyond what is on the surface, and that's really what I'm trying to get at. Because you can say, oh, it's the president, it's the Congress, or whatever. But in reality, there's all these other people who are operating, at the same time. And even in the international arena, where we talked about the third player being involved here, an extra state, an extraterritorial state with the Nazis still being operative today. And people just, a lot of people look at that and they just want to balk.
Well, it's understandable that they want to balk, because you're dealing, when you say something like that, you're dealing with something that to the normal mind is just incomprehensible, because it requires an independent system of financing. It requires a very hidden organization and structure that would make the mafia and the Latin American drug cartels pale into insignificance. It requires an independent intelligence organization. It requires research facilities, technicians, scientists conducting all this. You're dealing when you say that there exists a Nazi international and extraterritorial state of that sort. You're dealing quite literally with something that is huge in its implications, and most people simply cannot wrap their mind around that. But the illustration I like to give is think of a multinational corporation, but think of it as being entirely hidden, and with its own funding and resources and personnel, with its links to the public world. That's about the best way to think of it.
And it's and as you say, it's a difficult concept for people to grasp, because it does call into question a lot of belief systems that people have, and it kind of almost is in the same category of religion, I suppose, in some ways, because there's a certain amount of invested interest in kind of keeping the status quo. There's definitely an American civil religion, and this notion definitely challenges some of its cardinal doctrines. Indeed. Well, we're almost done, but I did want to ask you real quick, Joseph, if you could. Do you see because someone in the chat room brought this up, the TR3B? Do you see this as being some form of new propulsion system that they're using with this craft?
Yes, I do. And if you want to know what kind of propulsion system that I think it uses, go read the Nazi International and read Chapter 9, where you have that kind of propulsion system outlined by the Nazi scientist working for Juan Perón back in the 1950s.
Oh, excellent. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's your answer, chat room guest. Read Nazi International, Chapter 9, and he'll tell you what he thinks the TR3B is using as their propulsion system. So, Joseph, I mentioned GizaDeathStar.com. Is that the premier place for people to find you and find your books and your
the website, that's my website. That's where they can make contact with me. There's a web store there, or they can go directly to Amazon and get the books there.
Okay, that's great. And I understand you have a subscription service that you have on your website as well. And this gives people who want extra access to you and to shows that you do, video chats that you give to people, and where you can interact with your fans and with people who are interested in the topics that you do research on. So I highly recommend people check that out. So if you're interested in following up on Joseph Farrell and his work, definitely go to GizaDeathStar.com, and you can register there. And if you're interested, you can also become a subscriber to his more in-depth research and his additional material, and also, of course, his books. And he's quite prolific. He's come out with several titles, and you can find them on his website as well. And we've talked about several of them on the show today. But with Joseph, we could talk about many different subjects, because he's tackled a lot of them in all the different books that he has done. But today we got into the Nazis and their survival after World War II, and of course the Nazi Bell, the connection with Kecksburg, and the type of propulsion system, the type of energy production we're dealing with here, and a new type of physics. And the various connections and the survival of Nazi corporate interests and the survival of Nazi finance streams after the war leads us to a state of affairs today, and throughout the 60, 70 years since World War II ended, where we're still pretty much in a very precarious situation where we have actors acting outside the realm of scrutiny, and we have a very real possibility of these things coming to a head at some point. And Joseph is working on a new project right now where he's going to detail where the Nazis, the surviving Nazi faction is going, and where the end result is, where he thinks the end result is going to come. And so keep your eye out for his new work that's going to be coming out in the future. And with that, I'll say join us next week for another episode here on InceptionRadioNetwork.com for another episode of the Stench of Truth radio show next week, Friday from 7 to 9 p.m. And I'll thank Joseph Farrell for joining us. Thank you, Joseph, very much. It was an excellent show. I'm very glad that you joined us for the show today. So bid you all good night, and I'll catch you next week.
1, 2, 3, 4.